Jesus left the temple, verse 1 of Matthew 24, and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." That's the very basis of everything they want to know. Within that, they think that it's going to entail the end in whatever shape and form. Remember, they don't, at this point, they're not even convinced about a resurrection of Jesus. They're surprised. Remember, they are surprised when they come back and say that he is risen. He's not there, he's risen. What do? Peter and John run back to see if it's true. I tell you the truth, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. As he said on the Mount of Olives, in the book of, I have these three side by side. Where are we? His disciples. Lost my beginning here. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, the four that are there, and they ask him, and I'll summarize it here. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So Matthew gives really three questions. Mark and Luke give two questions to this. And as he, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, that's Mark chapter 3 and verse 4. And Jesus answers them in verse 4 of Matthew chapter 24. He answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." So he tells them, he gives us a warning, and the warnings are several of them throughout there. "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." The end of what? At this point, they don't know what the end is he's speaking. But within the conversation, he will let them know what this end that he's talking of. He says in verse 7 of Matthew 24, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows." They're not the end, they're the beginning. In the Old Testament, if you read the book of Isaiah, you read the book of Jeremiah, you read the book of Ezekiel, over and over, there talks about at least three, if not four things that God uses as a judgment against the nations. And what are they? Famine, war, pestilence, and wild beasts. Wild beasts is kind of an unusual one, but it's used enough. Those are the four things that he uses as a judgment against them. And guess what things are listed here? "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." What is that? That's war. "And there will be famines." Which one is that? That's famines. "And there will be pestilences." Pestilences. Okay? So there'll be earthquakes in various places. And earthquakes is another thing. So when you read these in the Old Testament, you understand that he's talking about a judgment that's going to come. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. You think it might be the end, but it's only the beginning. Luke adds in Luke 21, verse 11, he says, "And there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven." As if these three that are listed, isn't enough, there'll be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. So he gives us these things that he's telling them, these things are going to happen. The end is not yet. Matthew chapter 24, verse 9, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you." There's a real bright spot. There's a selling point. You know, when people are trying to sell you on something, trying to say, this is why you should become a member here, this is why you should buy this is why you should invest in this. They don't tell you the negative, do they? They give you the positive. But here he says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you." Sound like a good selling point? Anybody ready to sign up? "And you will be hated by all nations, and every one of them says, 'For my name's sake.'" They're not going to hate you because you are Jewish or that you're a Christian, but they're going to hate you because of my name, which in a sense is because you're Christian, but you're going to hate you for my name's sake. Then many will be offended for my name's sake.
RSV says many will fall away.
Many will fall away. Okay? They will betray one another and will hate one another. Jesus has mentioned this before. Will betray one another and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. This just sounds better and better, doesn't it? Verse 13, he who endures to the end shall be saved. Sound familiar? Sounds like it could be a sermon, don't you think? Endure to the end. Just begin the journey, make it halfway through the journey, or make it all the way to the end. It's not a multiple choice. But he who endures to the end. Here's a time marker. And usually if during the Gospels they will say, and this was to fulfill this prophecy. And you remember when they divided his garments? Okay? That was a fulfillment of a prophecy. I call that that's a real time stamp. That's a stamp you can put there, and you can say, okay, this is part of it. Once that's been fulfilled, it doesn't need to be fulfilled again. And this gospel, verse 14 of Matthew chapter 24, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. We got to this point last week, and then we started chasing a lot of rabbits. Why do you think the gospel had to be preached to all nations?
Otherwise, people could say they have an excuse for not believing in Christ.
Okay, all right. Same excuse a lot of people use today. Well, it hasn't reached the deepest, darkest jungles of Brazil yet. You know that, don't you? Or somewhere in the Congo of Africa. But remember, this is being spoken in the first century. But there's another reason, and once you realize it, you'll say, oh, that makes sense. Who must hear the gospel first? The Jews. That's why the gospel has to go into all of the world first. Because he's giving them that chance, one last chance, to hear the gospel. Because what happens when the temple is destroyed? Remember, Jesus said, I'm going to take that kingdom that belonged to them. Who's he going to give it to? He's going to give it to he's going to give it to the Christians. I'm going to take this temple away, I'm going to take what you have and give it to another. And he's talking about the church. It's going to be taken away. And once it's taken away, does it belong to them? Are they ever going to get it back? No, it's the end. That's why the gospel has to be preached to every creature. That is why Paul goes where first in his journeys? Goes to the synagogue first. Because salvation comes from the Jews. And they need to hear it. Jesus told his disciples, he said, where are you going to go first? Jerusalem, then Judea, bigger circle, then Samaria comes next. Why Samaria? They're half Jews. They are part of that, even though the Jews did not recognize them. They hated them. They were half-breeds, as it were. It says then you're going to go to the outermost parts of the world. But it has to go to the Jews first. The Jews have to have every opportunity to respond to the gospel. That's why he says, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. Mark says the same thing in Mark 13:10. And the gospel must, not will, but must. It's a key word to remember. Must be preached to all the nations. Mm-hmm. Yep. And we remember from the prophecy of Isaiah that where is the word going to go out of? We call it Jerusalem. What do they call it? Mount Zion. It's going to come out of Mount Zion first. That's where the word's going to come, and it does. It's a fulfillment when Jesus says you're going to start in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, outermost parts of the world. It's a fulfillment of the prophecy. But, he says, and these parts are in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21, when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Luke says, therefore settle in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. They'll resist it, really. But he says they won't be able to. They can't argue against the fulfillment of these scriptures. Now brother will betray brother, Mark says, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you'll be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. That's Mark. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he says, not a hair, Luke says in Luke 21:18, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. That's good news for people like me. Because I'm nearly as bald as a cue ball. By your patience, possess your souls, Luke says. In a way, what Matthew says, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. You see, they're all saying essentially the same thing. But it's sort of like, do you remember the little projectors where you used to put the little round circle in there, and when you see through both eyes, it looked like it was in 3D? Viewmaster, that's what it is. Seeing three Gospels at once is like a Viewmaster. You get a more completer, the completerest picture you're going to get of this. When you see them all together. Yes. Yes. Endure to the end. And so as we move on to Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, he says, and I think this is maybe where we came to. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Mark says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. We're kind of getting an idea there's something in Daniel that talks about the abomination of desolation. Luke says, and we got them side by side so we know exactly what they're saying. But when you see Jerusalem slow down. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. And when you see all three of those side by side, as they are hearing it and being told this, what does it mean? Are they talking about the year 2025? When you, pretend that you're there in the audience, those four, when you see, and how many of those four are going to be alive? One. John. John's the only one. John is the last apostle. Tradition tells us about how they all died. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. What does that mean? If we don't know anything about history, what would you assume that means? You don't want to be here. So he says, know that its desolation is near. The abomination of desolation, standing where it ought not. Remember, what is the context? What's this whole chapter about? The destruction of Jerusalem. When is this going to happen? What are going to be the signs? Here's the sign. When you see it surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. Then he tells them, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Mark says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What is he trying to tell them? Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This isn't rocket surgery, is it? It's not that hard to understand when you look at it. He's saying when the armies surround it. Now we know history. We have read, and I told you about the book of Josephus. And if you really want a page turner, read the book of Josephus. And Josephus, in the War of the Jews, spends copious amounts of time talking about this very incident, is a surrounding of Jerusalem. The armies came from Rome because the Jews had their own little uprising going. And the Jews were not going to let them take Jerusalem because thinking, look what we did in the Old Testament. This is God's city. Nothing's going to happen to us. When you get further in the book of Revelation, it says, we're no widow. Nobody's going to kill us. We're no widow. This can't happen to us. When you see the army surrounding Judea, I want you to get out of there. And you know what is recorded by historians? How many Christians were killed? None. Why? Because they're warned. He's telling them the word. What are going to be the signs? Yes, these are going to be the signs. You're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars. You're going to read about all of the civil wars that are going on. And there's a year that's called the Year of Four Caesars. Nero dies, and you have 3 pseudo-Caesars who have no power whatsoever. 2 of them are murdered and 1 commits suicide. Until Vitellius comes back. Vespasian comes and then becomes the Caesar. He's going to solidify everything. But you're going to hear about all of these things. I want you to get up. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Why? There's no time. Josephus records that there was a point to which the one who was in charge had to leave to take care of problems down in Egypt. Is that where Egypt is at? Wherever Egypt, I'm pointing at it. Go down. When he does, the siege is lifted and the Christians get out. He says, when you see this, I want you to get out. Don't go back. You only have a short period of time. It's all recorded in history. It is so easy. But woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter on the Sabbath. Why? It's difficult. Absolutely difficult to get out of there. And if you are hindered in any way, and that's why he tells them, get out of there. Any questions on those?
One is saying, on the Sabbath. So this is talking about, and it says many times that it's going to happen, within this next generation. Well, 2,000 years later, I'm still, talking about the second coming. And when Jesus and the apostles talk about the second coming being within a lifetime, that's kind of part I'm a little confused about. Because if you're still saying like not on the Sabbath, so understand that the Sabbath would still be in effect.
Yes. Sabbath, and we're talking about when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. The Jews are still practicing the law. And part of the law was they were closing the gates. If you go back to the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah was so upset because you people are coming in here and you're doing work on the Sabbath, you're coming in here and selling things, so he closes the gates. And he warns them of anyone who is going to be caught outside the gate of what he's going to do to them. So you can read that in the book of Nehemiah. So they are closing the gates on the Sabbath. Pray that it's not on the Sabbath. Because if the gates are closed, how are you going to get out of there? And there were a lot of gates in Jerusalem. More than a dozen. He said they'll all be closed. Pray that it does not happen on the Sabbath. Because they'll be closed. And you have to get out of there when you have the time. Don't go back down to get things. Does that answer your question?
No, because it's talking about the second coming being within that age, that generation.
He's not talking, and you have the disadvantage of this, but he's not talking about the second coming because he doesn't talk about that until verse 36. Because he's going to say, when you see all of these things happening, this generation will not pass away till all these things happen. So it has to be things that are talked about in that generation. So it's not the second coming.
Well, because he talks in the chapter about the trumpets and sounding, and everybody gathered from the four
It sounds like the second coming, but it is before. He talks about all of these things will happen before in this generation. What he means, you want to know what it what it means when he says he's going to gather them from the four winds? We've already talked about it, actually, because in chapter 7, and you go back to Ezekiel chapter 9, he says, he's calling from the four winds, don't do anything until I have marked those. Until I have marked them. And how did he mark them? Until I marked them on the forehead. Until I put my mark on them. Don't do anything. Because remember, he's opened the seven seals. These are things that are about to happen. He says, before these things begin to happen, put your mark on them so nothing happens to them. So in a sense, that's what he's talking about gathering from the four winds. He's not talking about the second coming. He's talking about marking them so nothing happens to them. And when we get to that, it'll be, we've jumped just a little bit ahead. But that's the short answer. He says, but not a hair on your head is going to, shall be lost. So we've got down to verse 20. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. And we talked about that a little bit in the sermon. When was the greatest tribulation that ever happened in the world, or ever will happen? He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. It'll never be that bad again. It never will be. So when we begin to talk about things that are happening, and people say, well, we're waiting for the Great Tribulation, or we're talking about, what's the word they use? The rapture. First of all, there's no such word as rapture in the Scripture, nor is the idea in there about the rapture. It's all taking place here. The Great Tribulation is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And unless those days are shortened, no flesh would have been saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Yep. 36 and 37. We're not there yet, but I'll read it. Verse 36. Let me read verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. All what things? Everything I have just described. This generation. We know what a generation means. He's not talking about when this world ends. No, he's talking about this generation. And the generation that Jesus is talking about is a 40-year period from about 30 AD until 70 AD. This generation is not going to pass away till all of these things happened. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. No one knows. Not even the angel of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Now we're talking about the end of the world. The second coming. But up to that point, he says all of these things are going to happen in this generation. There's your timestamp right there. Right there is where he says, when it says this generation, now you know. You can say, okay, all of these things, so no matter what he talks about, when he's talking about collecting those from the four winds, talking about the Great Tribulation, when will the Great Tribulation happen? In verse 24. In that generation. There's your timestamp. It cannot be any clearer. So no matter how you try to reshape it and say, we're talking about the 21st century, it can't, because it must happen in that generation, because Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. You cannot get around it. And when John says in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, when he talks about things that must shortly come to pass, when is he talking about? Things that must shortly come to pass. If you cannot lock in on verse 1 with everything that you're talking about in the book of Revelation, if you're still talking about things that are happening 2,000 years ago, things that must shortly come to pass, is that 2,000 years? Is it 1,000 years? Is it 500 years? Is it in this generation? Things that must shortly come to pass. Verse 3 of Matthew. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. What does he mean by the elect? Christians. Even Christians can be fooled by this. He says, see, I've told you beforehand. I've warned you about these things. I've told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Or look, who is in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. He's still talking about this generation. When he talks about the coming of the Son of Man, he's talking about judgment. Because remember, he tells the high priest, you're going to see me coming in the clouds. Does that mean he's going to see him physically in the clouds? It's the same language that's used in the Old Testament when he talked about the judgment of Nineveh, the judgment of Babylon, the judgment of Edom. It's the same words used there. When you see the Lord come riding on the clouds. He's not talking about physically seeing him riding on the clouds. He's talking about then know your judgment is coming. And you're going to see it. You're going to experience it in your lifetime. Wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered. When you see this evidence, you know that it's there. Verse 29. Let's see, are we still there? Yes, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. Remember, he has just said you're going to see the riding on the clouds. Now he says immediately after the tribulation of those days. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Is he talking about eclipses? Is he talking about asteroids hitting the earth? Go back, and I have these written on page 8. If you have, how many people did not get a copy of the notes? I have them here. But the same language is used. When God talks about judgment that comes upon a nation, he speaks in these terms. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give us light, and the stars will fall from heaven. Really, those are the same words that Peter uses on the day of Pentecost. And what does he tell that generation? Save yourself from this untoward generation. Because Joel chapter 2 is talking about the institution of the church beginning. Peter says, these are those days. But now he says, he's talking about the end of Judaism before those days come. When the sun will be dark, the moon will not give us light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. What does it mean when the powers of heaven shall be shaken? There's going to be great things happening in empires. Those are the words that they mean when they talk in the Old Testament. He's not talking about physical earthquakes, although there could be earthquakes. But these are symbolic terms that are used over and over and over in the Old Testament about kingdoms being taken down by God. Because remember what he told Daniel. Daniel chapter 2. Who rises up kingdoms? Who brings down kingdoms? And this is symbolic of what he does. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. It sounds like the second coming, doesn't it? But it's not. It's the same language used in the book of Zechariah when it talks about the end of Jerusalem.
Would the battle hymn of the Republic be referring to the same kinds of events?
What are the words of the Battle Hymn of the Republic?
Eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the mighty lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
The same words that are used in the book of Revelation, but those are terms that are used referring to that day and age of the first century. If that makes sense. Even though the writer of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is...
Was that at the Civil War that was written?
Battle Hymn of the Republic, I think, was written during the Civil War, yeah.
They may think they're talking about a future time, but those words, those symbols are talking about things that happened in the first century. And remember, up to this point, then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Same quotation from the book of Zechariah, if you read it. Go back there and read Zechariah, and they're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's all there if you're willing. And now let's stay here for another couple hours. What do you say? Wait, you don't have anywhere to go. Come on.
You're going to treat us all to the chicken place?
Yeah, everybody, Chick-fil-A's on me today only. And he will send out his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and then he will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven. Sounds like the end of the world, but remember, he has not said yet in verse 36 or verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So it has to have taken place in that day and age, and it's symbolic of the very same things that are written in the Old Testament. And that's where we'll begin next week, because that gives you an awful lot to study, doesn't it?